Welcome to the Informed Simplicity Project, a place where we're taking a shared journey to learning more about ourselves and our bodies. I'm Jordan Harris, my co-host, Dr. Julia Conroy, and this is episode 2 of our Polyvagal series, Why Zebras Don't Have Nervous Systems. I'm talking today about the nervous system. And so this is, I feel like, something that you, Dr. Conroy, are like really into, like really knowledgeable about, more than a lot of therapists. Partly, this is what you did your dissertation on, and also you actually took a class on physiology, right? Which is like the thing that we probably should all be doing, right? And no therapist thinks I'm going to take a class on physiology, but it matters. It matters a lot. Yeah. And I just sort of want to back up for a second as we dive into this conversation and say, in therapy, we talk a lot about the autonomic nervous system, right? Like in therapy worlds. And the way that I understand it is that actually that's not the whole nervous system, right? Mm-hmm. And for someone like me, I break it down into something very simple, and I say we have a voluntary nervous system, and we have a automatic nervous system, right? And the voluntary nervous system controls things like, things that I can do voluntarily, automatic, things that I can do with effort, right? So it controls like my muscular system. Now the automatic nervous system, the other side of it, is all the things that I can't control voluntarily, like my heartbeat. And so we're going to get into that and all of the things that the autonomic branch of the nervous system does. But before we do, I just want to check in with you. Is that basic conceptualization correct? We have a voluntary.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to start there, because I think, especially when I think about clients coming in with anxiety, or the way that we often understand anxiety, it's because I think that my automatic involuntary system should be under my control the way that my voluntary system is. And that's really just not how it works. And so usually when clients are coming in for some sort of panic disorder, anxiety disorder, it's because I don't have control over my involuntary system. That's never a surprise. That's never concerning. Nobody should have an effortful control over that, right? But it's often when I feel like it's just out of control. Like I don't understand at all where it's coming from, or it's kind of taking over, it's inhibiting function from what I'm wanting. And so I think really understanding this system with more depth kind of allows us to have a more clear framework with which how not to get it under control, but to understand the function that it serves.
Yeah, you say that, and it just makes me think of all the people I know who, when they have anxiety or when they have panic attacks or when they have something along those lines, their heart rate increases, right? And it's just as, like they don't have any control over how fast the heart beats, not effortful, not voluntary control on a daily basis. So why would they have that same sort of control when they're in the middle of an anxiety attack or a panic attack?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are a bunch of things that the autonomic nervous system sort of controls, right? Automatically, outside of conscious sort of effort. And the other side of this is where we sort of get into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches, right? So the autonomic nervous system is split into 2 branches. One, that's the sympathetic, that's all about arousal, right? Activation, mobilization. And then the second part of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic branch. And this one is about helping us to be calm, helping us to, be vegetative, helping us to sleep and grow. But the problem is that framing. like when we talk about it that way, is you have one that's sympathetic, one that's parasympathetic. Why is that problematic?
Yeah, I think we often, this early understanding of kind of classifying the different functions that they have, is that oftentimes, and we even see this in Sapolsky's book, right, that they're pitted against one another. Okay, that my sympathetic is overactivated, it's doing too much. Okay, how can I utilize the fight, right, if you will, of my parasympathetic to combat it and to beat it down into submission? Like pitting one against the other kind of sets up this framework where one is good and the other is bad, that I attempt to suppress the one because I prefer the state of the other, which is honestly dangerous. And I know that sounds strange to say, but what we're seeing in research now is that both of these systems actually are working together. They have two very different strategies, but both are trying to do is to try to keep the body in an optimal state of functioning, which is also called homeostasis, right? And so there's a certain body temperature, there's a certain like rate of processing for all of these different functions where your body knows this is when I'm at my best. And both of the systems, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, are doing what they can to keep the body in homeostasis. They just have two different strategies because both are needed. In moments where I'm in some sort of danger, I need to be activated, right? I need to be mobilized to do something about it in order to keep my body in the safest state possible, right? But then I also need to be able to calm down and relax when that's no longer necessary. And so I think that's the beautiful part of the research that's coming up now, and especially supported by the polyvagal theory, is okay, both of these systems are ultimately working for the good of the human body, trying to keep it at its best functioning possible. We need both strategies in different scenarios, but we need a balance and flexibility and fluidity between the arousals of both systems in order to keep us in our best state.
Yeah, so it's like when we split the autonomic nervous system into sympathetic and parasympathetic, we also pit them against each other.
Yeah.
And that's a problem because both are actually helpful.
Right, exactly.
And I've definitely seen this. You know, I've seen other therapists talk about clients, and I think they really mean well, but they talk about it as though the person shouldn't be anxious, they shouldn't be whatever, and they need to actually like use deep breathing skills, right, to bring them back down. And kind of what they're saying is this person's sympathetic system is too high, and we got to use the parasympathetic to control it.
Yeah, to like master it, to suppress it. Absolutely. Because one is preferable over the other, right? Which makes sense because when my parasympathetic system is activated, I usually feel a whole lot better. Right? I feel relaxed. I feel at ease. I'm feeling good, right? But also, I can't be in a calm state for my whole life. Right? That's just not the world that I live in. And I'm sure that you live in, and everyone listening is living in, that we need a stress response at times when our kids do something where we need to step in really quick and keep them safe, right? I need to be able to kind of activate a little bit when I've got a big deadline and I need to get motivated and get mobilized to get it taken care of. If we are looking to suppress the sympathetic nervous system, we lose some of the most essential parts of our functioning.
Yeah. And I think this is actually where the polyvagal theory sort of comes in, right? It goes back to last week when polyvagal theory says instead of this sort of yin and yang fighting against each other, there's a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is dependent on how safe you feel. And so not only does it split this parasympathetic into two different branches, which I think in and of itself can kind of be confusing. But basically what it says is these responses are not pitted against each other. There's a hierarchy that's meant to keep us safe. So if we're safe and social, right, that's one state that we can be in. That's a parasympathetic sort of response. But if we are under attack, then we can go into a sympathetic sort of state, which is a way to keep us, to protect ourselves from threats. And if we think that we're going to die, that's when, okay, we reuse the parasympathetic system in order to keep ourselves safe long term.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. And so I need to understand my sympathetic and parasympathetic response as an indicator of how safe my body feels in a space. I saw a client for the first time 2 weeks ago who came in presenting with anxiety, and she said, and I just asked, you know, kind of what life looked like right now. And she said, well, we're doing layoffs at work. Like, basically, I've been told if I don't like hit these thresholds or these markers or come in, my team doesn't come in at this percentage, I'm probably going to lose my job right before the holidays, right? And also things at home in her marriage, things are up in the air. Her and her husband are contemplating divorce. And she's like, I just feel so anxious all the time. And it's like, I don't know what to tell you because your body's not malfunctioning with that anxiety. There is a lot of danger present at work. There's a lot of danger present at home where there's so much instability and uncertainty. Your anxiety is not malfunctioning here. This is your body constantly on high alert. And it should be. It should be letting you know that a threat is very present from multiple angles. This is just giving you a cue about how safe I feel right now. This is not malfunctioning. There's nothing broken here. And there's still some things we can do to alleviate that, but there's nothing broken in this state of life.
Yeah, it's like, okay, your body's picking up on the fact that there's a lot of things you got to get mobilized about.
Yeah.
You gotta you gotta activate and get your energy up and do a lot of stuff at work if you want to keep your job.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's designed, right, to give that energy and to supply that effort where our body's picking up that it's so needed. Right. Because the results are going to be devastating if I don't.
Right. So that's really big. And then you said something else that I think is really important, right? You talked about homeostasis. The way I think about that is balance. Is that sort of a way to think about it? Like my body's always trying to maintain balance with myself and with my environment.
Yes. And I think balance, I've heard it used kind of in a tricky way with even like parasympathetic, sympathetic, like they're both holding in balance, or like parasympathetic dominating, that's the balance, right? When you're relaxed. And so I have really appreciated the results of Selye. He did a lot of the original stress research, phenomenal work. What he really found and how he kind of took away maybe those connotations of that balance is, okay, this is literally your body knows where it, like the levels where it functions best. So pH levels, like body temperature, all of it. Like I know optimum functioning, and I'm always looking to get you to the point of optimum functioning, right? And so it does this physiologically. When I start to exercise or exert myself physically, here comes sweat, right? Because my body's like, okay, don't get overheated. This is the temperature where your body functions best. We're going to do what it takes. Then when stress hormones are released into the body, right, during moments of distress, there are also these compensatory responses that the body has, all seeking to create this balance within the body for homeostasis, which ultimately leads to the optimum functioning that our body's constantly striving for.
I think that's a really good distinction too, right? Like by balance, we don't mean like I'm in this state where I'm like a yogi and I'm like emotionally centered, peace, and I'm calm. Like, no, we mean like
your body doesn't care about that.
right. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about balance in the sense of optimal functioning for where I am right now. And so if I'm in a situation at work where my boss is saying, hey, if you don't hit these markers, you're going to be fired. Balance means something different than if I am home watching TV with my partner.
Yeah,
those are different types of balance that you need in that moment.
Yeah, and it should look different, right? It's not your body malfunctioning. It's really trying to keep you safe physiologically, making sure that there's a balance, that it's functioning where it needs to kind of carry out the functions that are being present.
Yeah. So there's one other thing I want to sort of touch on here, which is, so in the old model, the autonomic system has two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and they're fighting against each other. And in the new model, right, in the polyvagal theory model, it's almost like there are three branches, right? There's this 3-level hierarchy. And what we've done in polyvagal world is we're saying, actually, the parasympathetic has two types of responding. Right? One that's social and one that's more protective. I'm going to sort of try to simplify it. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Like how we went from having, two that sort of are antagonistic to having three.
Yes, absolutely. So this traditional idea of sympathetic versus parasympathetic, that's covered in the book that we're covering, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Basically, Zapolsky does a great job of summarizing this more traditional argument, which basically comes from a place that makes sense, because the sympathetic activates kind of the opposite of what the parasympathetic does. So everything that the sympathetic does, it pumps out blood to the limbs to, really activate mobilization. And in order to do that, it's like, all right, we're done with complex thinking. We're done with digestion. Like, you don't have a sex drive here. Like, we shut down everything to really prioritize this mobilization, because that's what's most necessary for survival. Even things like, obviously, your heart rate beats up to make sure that happens, but it really seeks to mobilize more than anything else. There's also like an awareness in the senses, right? So my vision kind of becomes sharper in those moments, because all of these changes are meant to maximize my chances of survival for whatever threat is present. Whereas the parasympathetic does the opposite of all of those things, right? That heart rate can slow again. The blood is more evenly distributed throughout the body. Digestion starts again. I can be aroused sexually. My muscles aren't as tight and primed for mobilization. They can relax. My digestion starts again. Immunity goes up. All of these things, because it's like, all right, we no longer need to, distribute all of this to prioritize mobilization. We can kind of regulate. Everyone gets their fair share of attention and energy at this point. So you can see, given those functions, given what that looks like on the surface, it feels like those are opposed to one another, right? It makes sense. They're doing kind of opposite functions. However, our bodies, what polyvagal theory is saying is, we're not in this state of tug of war between one and the other, where it's like, all right, let's figure out how to make our parasympathetic stronger so that we're no longer susceptible to the sympathetic nervous system and subject to whatever it decides we're feeling. And instead, what polyvagal is saying is, all right, all systems, right, are really looking to do what's best for the person. But those functions should look different depending on the level of safety that's present. So in a perfectly safe space, humans are meant to connect, and they're meant to basically have that parasympathetic system come online. that I can be relaxed, that I can connect with others, that I can be intimate with them, that I can have this sex drive, that my immune system's functioning, that I can relax and be creative in these ways, and really, this idea of self-actualization, that I can live into that. But when there is a threat present, that shouldn't be there, right? That I need to prioritize protecting myself in that moment. If I'm ever going to get back to that state, right, I need to focus on protecting myself now to make sure there's anything left of me to get back to that state. So protection becomes the priority. And the sympathetic system really activates what's needed to prioritize that protection. And even just like we talked about in the last episode, if it gets to the point where there is this freeze response that comes online, when the threat feels so imminent and so dangerous that this could end my life, that even this protective function emerges where let me just freeze, let me die as painlessly as possible, just so that this can be over.
Yeah.
That those are more protective responses that are necessary because of the threat that's present. And ultimately, looking to go back to that point of safety and that point where the parasympathetic can be activated. The tricky part, according to polyvagal theory, though, is when we have rigidity in the ways that we're activated, and rigidity in that protection, that we're not able to be fluid according to the threat that's present, but that we get stuck in this place that we feel like a threat is always present.
Yeah. It sounds like a big part of what you're saying is, so our autonomic nervous system has two branches. One that speeds us up, the sympathetic, one that sort of pauses us, the parasympathetic. But the parasympathetic can pause us for different reasons. It can pause us to help us to connect to other people, but it can also pause us to help us to protect ourselves. And so that's why we have the sort of three different branches. And the problem is when we can't switch between all three, when we get rigid and stuck in one.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You actually talked on this, but I think this is also really important, right? The different functions, the different body systems that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic produce. And I actually made a list here, right? Like, and we're just going to go through 5 areas of the body. In your eyes, the sympathetic causes your pupils to dilate, and the parasympathetic causes your pupils to constrict. And that's so, if your pupils dilate, you can take in more information. You're more primed to take in that information to protect yourself. In your mouth, right? Salivation stops when the sympathetic is turned on, and it starts when the parasympathetic is turned on. In your heart rate speeds up when your sympathetic is activated, and when your parasympathetic is activated, your heart rate slows down. In your stomach, right? And I guess also in your intestines, I'd have to ask you about this, but digestion stops when the sympathetic system is activated, and it gets going again when the parasympathetic is activated. And then also sexually, the sympathetic is what allows you to orgasm, and then the parasympathetic is what allows for arousal. So these are sort of the things that he talks about in the book, right? Like these are the physical systems in your body, and which state you're in dictates which of these behaviors you can do.
Absolutely.
So here's the big question. This is really what got me into polyvagal theory, right? Like there was a time when I wanted to like read people and like understand what they were thinking through their facial expressions and all this stuff. And one of the things that you learn in polyvagal theory is that the face is the display system for the body. You can generally tell what state someone is in. You can tell where they are on that ladder
Mm-hmm.
by how their face looks.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think this is another cool part of polyvagal. Like, of course, the facial expressions, like I can tell, especially if I know someone well, like, okay, you're smiling, but like this is off. Something's like not real here. That our bodies are really primed to be able to recognize that state in others, because we this herd mentality.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody has a reason to be worried, it does me good to be able to recognize that quickly, because there's probably a threat coming for me as well. And so this is where we see, mirror neuron conversations start, because just seeing that you're activated, seeing that someone next to me is activated, gets me activated, because I'm like, oh shoot, like, is there something I should be worried about too? And this is also what Porges says, is it's not just the facial cues, but also your vocal tone, right? Which makes sense. Like, even if you're talking to someone on the phone, you don't see their face at all, but you can hear in their voice when something's off. You can hear in their voice when something's not okay. And it just shows, right, in these moments, we're looking for cues, we're assessing for safety, both for us, yes, and being aware of the environment, but also checking in with other people, because that gives us cues of how safe we are, is how safe we feel like other people in a shared space are as well.
Yeah, let's actually go into some of these cues, right? Kind of get specific. And basically what he says is you want to look at the muscles in the upper part of the face, like kind of like above the nose.
Mm-hmm.
And so if someone is in the, sort of the top of the hierarchy, the top of the ladder, and they feel safe and social and they're able to connect, you might see a smile and you see the crinkles in their eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then if they're in that sort of fight or flight state, they're one rung down on that ladder, that's when you're going to see, like widened eyes in fear, maybe furrowed brows or tightened eyelids for anger, right? So it's displayed on the face.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they're at the bottom of the ladder, they're sort of in that freeze state, right? That's when you sort of see a lot of flat affect. And for me, this was so enlightening because I remember so clearly when I did in-home therapy, I had this family that I worked with, and it always freaked me out because there was this one mom that I worked with who was always super flat, and I could never figure out how to I feel like I was missing something between her and her kids. And then I'm like, she had been through so much stuff that she was stuck in a freeze state. So she
Just
couldn't be
totally
responsive to her
dissociated.
kids. Right. And so for me, it was like, oh, and actually for me, this has helped me to understand my own state better. Right. Because sometimes when I'm just like in the morning and I'm like, I can feel my face is just flat. I'm like, oh, I'm not in a good space. I need to go like do something because I have kids and I gotta get with the program. You know,
I gotta be
on.
on.
I gotta be on. Yeah. And it's like, oh, I can just being able to do that check-in, it helps me to check in with myself. So those are some of the like facial cues. Yeah.
Yeah, which you notice you don't have a lot of control over those a lot of times. Like, I can't really make my eyes crinkle, right? Which again, like, serves to this like involuntary response, right? But your body sends off these messages. Your body has these responses beyond what you can control, right? And so if I notice that I'm not okay, it's not necessarily like I always need to just force myself to smile, but I kind of need to look internally and say, okay, am I activated in some way? What are ways that I need to, take time to address that? Because this isn't conscious control. This isn't the voluntary part of our nervous system.
Yeah. I actually read a study once where they tested a bunch of people on like smiling. And it was 10%. 10% of people could actually control the muscles around their eye. that crinkle when you smile. So for 90% of us, it's impossible. Like you just either feel that way or you don't.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Which is crazy. What about vocally? You're talking about vocal cues. What are some of the vocal cues?
Yeah, and so, oh my gosh, I don't know enough like pitch terms, and I'm definitely not musically talented enough to like identify them. But basically, what I've read from Porges has said that there are more soothing tones, that there are specific pitches, that there are specific cadences that just feel more relaxed, that communicate a sense of safety. Right? Where if it's terse or if it's quick or if it's loaded or if it's charged, then that kind of puts us on edge, just because that cues that something's not okay here. He says, we wear our hearts on our sleeve, but we also wear them on our face, and we wear them in our vocal tones too, because all of these are signals that we're giving off, of how we're doing in the level of safety that we feel like is currently present.
Yeah. The little that I know is like when your voice is melodic and there's a lot of intonation, that's a cue, especially for other people, that you're safe. And when your voice goes up an octave, think of like a kid squealing. Yeah. That's a cue that like your body's in fight or flight.
Right.
And then I've also, the flatness of your voice. If your voice is sort of monotone, it's not a lot of modulation. People who really kind of deadpan, like that's a cue that like they're sort of more in that freeze level.
Yeah, absolutely. But you can tell incredibly adaptive for our bodies to be able to pick up on all of these cues, to read where someone else is and at times where we are.
Yeah. So we talked about the nervous system, right? And how it has different branches, and how what we're focusing on is the autonomic nervous system, which has a part that speeds you up and a part that pauses you, and it can pause you for protective reasons or for connective reasons. And there are all these different cues other people can see in us to know where we are, and we can see in other people to know where they are. Let's talk about glucocorticoids. Right. So everyone's favorite topic, right? What the heck is a glucocorticoid? Right. So I'm gonna say this, and I'm gonna hope that you will correct the stuff that I don't know. Because when we're talking about polyvagal, we're talking about the nervous system and the nerves. But these nerves communicate by releasing chemicals. And some of the chemicals that are released when we're in stress, two of the big categories of chemicals, I guess, are like adrenaline and glucocorticoids. So first off, is that understanding correct?
Yes, absolutely. Adrenaline or epinephrine is being used more now. That's kind of one classification of this initial response. And then the glucocorticoids are released a little bit delayed, but at kind of like a second tier of that response. Okay. Exactly.
And these are the chemicals that our nervous system puts out to change how our organs respond.
Exactly. And so, as we all know, there are some moments where I just need to be really quick, really fast. If the other week we were with my niece and I see her start to fall off of the coffee table that she had gotten up on, and I need just a quick burst of energy just to run and grab her and to kind of steady her in that moment. I don't need this super sustained response. But yesterday I gave a presentation I was pretty nervous about, right? And I need to be activated a little bit longer in those moments because I'm talking for 30 minutes, right? And so basically that initial burst of energy, that's the epinephrine, that's the adrenaline that's released into your system. But if the body's able to recognize, okay, we need more, like cortisol is still being pumped into the system. We need more. We need a sustained response. We need more energy here. This isn't just going to be solved in a matter of seconds. That's when it's kind of this cascading effect where a few different systems get spoken to say, we need more, and eventually hits those glucocorticoids, which results in this release of sugar, that's the glucose part, into the bloodstream to mobilize more energy, basically until that energy isn't needed anymore. Yeah. Until the brain is no longer sending the message, I need backup, I need more, I need firepower, whatever it is, like until it gets the message, we're done here and we're good, it will continue to release those glucocorticoids into the bloodstream. And there are studies that show that, you know, especially with people that are just like in prolonged periods of severe stress where there's just not easing up, these can be released for days. You can imagine the system is pretty depleted after that happens, but the body is incredibly adaptive to get, you know, the limbs and whatever is needed in order to mobilize to counteract that threat and to stay alive.
Yeah. So the first type of chemicals that your body sends off when you're in stress are adrenaline, which I think is like the British version of the British name for it, or epinephrine, which is I think the American word for it.
Yeah. We always have to do something different.
So I always have to do something different, us Americans. And then the second level of chemicals, if the stressor goes on for, you know, half an hour, longer periods of time, is basically cortisol, which the purpose of the cortisol is so your body can really release and use sugar, glucose, as an energy source.
Yes, absolutely. That I need kind of more firepower is the message that's given. I need more energy. I need to expend more. And so the body mobilizes to make that happen.
Yeah. And these are primarily chemicals of the sympathetic part, right? These are the ones that make you mobilize, that get you vigilant, that get you activated, they energize you.
Yes, but they also shut down the other function.
Right.
They shut down our immune system, right? Making us more susceptible to any sort of diseases. They make us less sexually aroused. So we're less likely to connect just because it's like, I don't have the space. I don't have the capacity to even be interested there. It shuts down our digestive system. That it kind of puts a hold on a lot of other parts of the body. And it also puts a lot of stress on the cardiovascular system, because the heart is having to work so hard to pump out all these glucocorticoids that it is exhausting for the system to work so hard to mobilize so much energy for such a sustained period of time. And especially like we talked about, when there's rigidity, when people remain stuck in these protective states, this has honestly a devastating impact on the body, on the cardiovascular system, on the digestive system, all of these systems that are kind of halted to prioritize the stress response, that we see all of these having really severe consequences if this stress is maintained over time.
Well, of course. I mean, it makes me think of, you know, I've had coworkers in the past who are always stressed and then they're always sick, right? They always have a cold, they always have some sort of virus, and it's like, I wonder if that's connected, you know? And I know for myself, when I'm stressed, the first thing that goes away is I don't get hungry. Right? Like, right. And it's like, okay, my nervous system has sent out these glucocorticoids to shut down my digestive system. So I'm not hungry, so that I have more energy to do X, Y, and Z, whatever the task is of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think you totally see it that way.
Definitely. Yeah, that's how the body mobilizes. And I think sometimes that response is like, oh no, when I'm stressed, I like to eat. Like I like to feel good. And that's kind of acting on something else that's usually not like a real imminent or pressing threat, but more like, I don't feel good and I want something that's going to make me feel good. Because when I'm stressed, I'm not like, ooh, I had a broccoli, sounds great right now. Like, let me get my steamer. I'm like, okay, where's the chocolate? How much ice cream do we have in our freezer right now? It's all of these things are going to release positive chemicals and make me feel good in those moments, but rarely a response when there's this imminent pressing threat.
Well, and that's also part of the glucose part, right? Like in those states, your body's craving sugar because that's the thing it needs to mobilize.
It's like, we're running out here.
Yeah.
We need to make sure we can sustain this. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's also sort of a big difference between the book and polyvagal theory, right? The book is looking at really the impact of glucocorticoids long-term on our different bodily systems. Polyvagal theory is talking about the different branches of the nervous system. And the way I think about this is like the highway and the cars, right? Like the highway is the different branches of the nervous system and where all the nerves go in your body. And then the glucocorticoids and adrenaline are the cars, right? They're the things that are traveling along this to get to different parts to get different things done.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect metaphor, right? And what it does is it appreciates the function that each one has because we need it. We need it to survive.
So let's talk about the last part of this chapter. I can see your face and you're like, I don't know, because they sort of throw in Sapolsky throws in, I think, the work of what's the lady's name? I can't think of her name now. I actually reached out to her. I think she's passed away. I read one of her articles. Shelley Taylor.
Yeah.
Who says, actually, instead of just fight or flight being our main mobilization response, we actually have another one that is really prominent in women. So there's a gendered aspect here, and she says that it's the tend and befriend response. That under stress, there are some of us, and it tends to be more women, who want to tend to others, and especially like children, right? And to befriend others, right? To rely on their social supports.
So you can see kind of early underpinnings of polyvagal that were being introduced at this time, but not really consolidated yet.
I mean, that's sort of my question, right? She's saying that this is another way to deal with stress. And my question is this like a protective version of the social engagement response? Is that kind of what that is? I don't know. I'm asking you.
Yeah. No,
how do we understand this in the context of?
Yeah. So basically Taylor's argument, which I do think was really important and really necessary at that time, was saying men have more of a tendency toward this limbic fight or flight response, that they're more likely to display that. Whereas women are more likely to utilize this other option of tend and befriend, which is basically to connect socially, and tied it in with this release of oxytocin and how that regulates. Maybe that activates the parasympathetic system so that it can better counteract that. Women maybe are more predisposed to do so, which makes sense, right? And I think it's an important observation. I think that this is early kind of signs of maybe there is another way that our body can respond to stress, right? I do think that the gender difference that she noticed is because of the acculturation process, especially that we see here in the US, where as a woman, even as a little girl, right, I was encouraged to talk about what was going on for me. And I was encouraged to share and to socialize. And, you know, that's what I did with my friends. We sat around and we talked, right? And that's how we bonded. And that was seen as normal, and that was encouraged, that I could share parts of myself and express that verbally and ask for the comfort that I needed there. Whereas growing up with an older brother, you did sports with your friends. You didn't have to talk, like you just did stuff, right? And if you talked, it was like, that's weird that you're talking. Oh, why would you say that to me? And so I think that especially with those traditional gender roles that are so emphasized, I just think that women are often encouraged to take advantage more of that tend and befriend, maybe taught and encouraged to utilize that social engagement system, whereas traditionally in men that's been seen as weak or as something that real men don't need to do, or you buck up and you deal with it, or you rub dirt in it, or by the bootstraps, or whatever, saying we've got 100 of them, right? But the message is all the same. Don't talk about it because that's weakness, right? And so if I'm cut off from that social engagement system, if I'm cut off from that level of safety, what other option do I have when stress comes than to fight or flee?
So, I mean, you would see it as a part of the social engagement system. He's actually, this is an early window into people realizing that we have a social engagement system.
Yeah, I mean, there are thousands of people, that have come out with different versions of this, just because I think it's so core to who we are as people. So people will call it different things: tend and befriend, social engagement, attachment, whatever you want to call it, because ultimately we're all studying people, right? And we notice the same things about people. So I do see those very much overlapping, that this is a way to deal with stress when stress comes, but it's safe enough for me to reach to the person next to me. That's this tend and befriend. My social engagement system can still be activated. This oxytocin can still be released in those moments.
Yeah. What about the Gottman research that says that men tend to be flooded more easily, right? Like if we're talking about arousal and how quickly arousal happens, which is sort of like I think part of the big push behind a fight or flight response. Like, does that not play into that, or is that also largely due to how we're socialized?
I think it is. Like, and again, this is me. A lot of it's me pulling from my personal experience and maybe what I've seen. But I think that especially when we talk about this idea of co-regulation, right? That I was encouraged to co-regulate more with my female friends around me and to talk about what's going on for me more. And so what we know about co-regulation research is that if I'm able to co-regulate and experience the comfort of another in my distress, I then am more likely and capable of self-regulation, right? And I think even in growing up with a brother, it was like, he wasn't as encouraged to co-regulate. It was like, you need to deal with this, you need to pull this together. And I saw that true in other families and people that we interacted with, that you need to kind of be tough in these spots, and you need to find, like, be a man, and you need to find a way to deal with it. And therefore we don't offer them as many co-regulatory experiences where they can develop that regulatory capacity to be used on their own, which leads to more flooding.
It's very interesting. I'm sort of taking it all in.
I'm sure as a dad with two boys. And so this is, again, I want to be clear, this is like my experience. This is kind of what I've seen, and I think how I've kind of made sense of those gender differences, because everything in our research says people are a lot more similar than they are different. We love to draw distinctions. We love to classify, this is how this is, and this is different, and this is the distinction between them. But in reality, it's a lot more similar, that there's a lot less biological difference, which means we look to the ways that we're socialized. What are we taught to do? What opportunities are we given to co-regulate around these places? And how does that set us up differently? And so these are my opinions, and I want to clarify that.
Yeah. I mean, there's different parts to this, right? Because he talks about this in the book a little bit, especially when supposedly talks about like how you can think of like groups of men going out to fight a battle. And like that's a version of the tend and befriend sort of response. So he even says, there's some ambiguity here. We're not really clear on this. We do see some of the same things in men. And then he also says, on the flip side with women, you have the motif of the mama bear, right? Who just goes out and is total fight. And I've heard stories of people who have run into mother bears when they're out hiking, and it's like like that is all terrifying. People talk about just like the sheer terror that they felt. Yeah. From this other mammal who's like, I'm going to rip your face off.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's definitely not set in stone in the book. And then also, and I have no idea, right? But I also know that the one thing that we have that is probably our superpower as a species is our ability to learn, and whatever biological predispositions we may or may not have, I think that for most of us, most of the time, if you look at a lot of the research, we are learning machines and we can learn different things. So I wouldn't be surprised if, in 20 years they came out with a study and said, yep, it's all socialization. And how would you know now? Because everyone you're testing on has been socialized this way.
I was going to say, it can be really hard to parse out, right? Because there are just so many things influencing, and every parent's going to do that different. And so I just think it's important to get curious around, does every child have opportunity to co-regulate? To be instilled with that capacity for self-regulation, because research says that's going to how we protect them from being flooded and overly activated in the future.
It's also interesting. I think he talks about this in this chapter because he also uses a lot of animal models throughout this whole book, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, we get to the section on hyenas, like that's stuff. I don't know if you know about hyenas, but like lions, right? Like in I think he talks about this too with lions. Is that in this section? Is that later on?
I think it might be later on. This one was the slaughterhouses and
those. But with like lions, like you do see both the males and the females being very aggressive. Right? They both are really good at using that fight or flight response. Like the females are the main hunters of the pack. You don't get that way unless you're able to be absolutely ferocious.
Yeah. 100%.
So.
Yeah, and so Jordan was laughing at me initially because this is really my soapbox, but it does, it like bothers me that we want to like restrict or like, okay, well, women just aren't as prone to this. They just like want to talk about it. And what it really does is it kind of creates this hierarchy, or again, pits them against one another. When in reality, social engagements, when it's activated, when we're able to tend and befriend, that is a good thing. That is a good stress response that leads to higher co-regulatory behaviors. It's not always an option. And gender, regardless of gender, we're able to activate to get where we need to, dependent on the threat.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to your thoughts last week on like framing, right? Like we do not want to frame things so that it is less accessible for boys to co-regulate.
Yes.
We want men and boys to be able to say, hey, this is what is going on for me. And to feel better after they talk about it.
Yeah. Because all people do.
Yeah.
It's just written on us. Like we can't choose. It's not dictated by gender.
Our physiology needs it, right?
Absolutely. That's when we're that's when we're at our best.
Well, thank you very much. So what was your big takeaway from this chapter of the book?
I honestly really just appreciated the distinction between that short-term response and the long-term response of stress, because I think what it does is clarifies for me, and especially the first time I read it, but still now, right, is it clarifies the issue is when I get stuck in this state. That's when it becomes devastating to my system, is when I get stuck in this long-term glucocorticoids are being released nonstop. That's when stress gets dangerous, right? And so how do I have more fluidity between my state, between the branches, so that I'm still able to access my stress response when I need it, but I'm not stuck there with this rigidity that keeps me from functioning the ways that I want to. And so I really appreciated that distinction.
Yeah, that's really cool. Flexibility is the key.
Absolutely.
I think for me, the big takeaway was how these different systems impact the body. It just made it much more concrete, right? Yeah. Like when I'm, and it helped me to make more sense of myself. When I'm anxious, I'm not hungry. You know, my digestion has shut down. That's what happens because my body is trying to be mobilized, you know, or I don't know. I remember a long time ago, I was really, really stressed. And after I got really, really stressed, I had this big thing to do. Then I got really, really sleepy. And looking back, I'm like, that was my freeze response probably coming online. I was that stressed.
Yeah.
And my body was real, like had almost flipped. I was using that parasympathetic energy, right, part of the nervous system, no longer for connection, but to slow me down and sort of put me at the bottom level of that ladder. I was like, man. So for me, just seeing how these things impact my physical body has made a lot of sense for me, and it's helped me to have a deeper understanding of my own responses to things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it clarifies too what our goal is in this, is to have the fluidity that we need between the states, right? And I understand them not to fight one against the other and make sure my parasympathetic is so dominant in these ways, but how can I have the fluidity that my body needs to function in the way that it should?
Yeah, I think that's so important. I have so many clients who come in and they say, I feel really anxious. Tell me to stop it. And then you tell me this horror story. It's like, actually, you feel anxious because you're alive and your body's working well. Like you feel anxious because
you're asking me to help you not be human.
Yeah. So, all right, Dr. Conroy, it's been a pleasure. I'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks, Jordan.